I'm pretty impressed. It's such a broad, sweeping package across so many areas that you did very well to pretty much remember that all.
Thank you, Jono. I remembered it all off the top of my head because of a photographic memory. I didn't retake any of this at all. This is the first take, one take wonder.
Hello and welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. I'm Jo Moyer, and with me today I have Mark Dulder, and our Newsroom Pro editor Jonathan Milne is stepping in for Tim in Auckland. Hi, Jono.
From an unusually sunny Auckland.
Today we're going to discuss tax, trimming the fat off the public service, and whether all those numbers really do stack up. Then we'll look ahead to the official launch of the campaign season this weekend. And of course, to wrap things up, we'll offer some recommendations. First up, tax, fiscal holes and disinformation, according to Nicola Willis at least. Mark, it's been an interesting couple of days since National put out their tax plan. It feels like it has been a game of tag when it comes to press conferences. There has been National coming out with what they've got, Grant Robertson coming out and saying, no, that's all completely wrong. And now we're getting into sort of the next level down of ministers and their individual portfolios saying, no, that's wrong on this bit of this tiny other bit of the plan that got put out by National. And it's a real back and forth at the moment. So to make everyone's life easy, can you please tell us what the sort of top lines were out of that tax policy announced by National?
Yeah, just on the first back, not the fourth. National has a $14.6 billion package of tax cuts and new taxes and reprioritizations and rollbacks and all sorts of things in there. The centerpiece is adjustment to income tax brackets, the bottom three brackets only, which means that for people earning more than $78,100 a year, there's no scaling of the tax cuts after that. So someone on a $300,000 salary is getting the same as someone on $80,000, which is politically clever. It kind of neuters that point of tax cuts for the rich, which they had been attacked on when they were talking about this beforehand. Alongside those tax bracket adjustments, they've got quite a few tax credits. Some aimed at middle earners, some at families with children who sort of are the big winners out of the policy. And then they've got a few changes to landlord tax settings. They're going to be returning the bright line test to 2 years from 10, and they're going to be rolling back or returning interest deductibility on rental properties. All of this is funded out of 4 new taxes and a bunch of sloshing around money within the government coffers. The new taxes are one on offshore online gambling operators, which has been the source of some contention since the announcement, so we're not sure exactly what the state of that is at the moment. They're partially rolling back the foreign home buyer ban. People from overseas will now be able to buy houses for over $2 million. Anything under that is still not allowed to be acquired by them, and they'll pay a 15% tax on that. The final 2 new taxes are commercial building depreciation, rolling back what the government did during COVID there, and raising immigration levies to be closer to what levels are in Australia. They'll also be moving money from the Climate Fund and ETS revenues into this and cancelling a bunch of government programs to help pay for these tax cuts. National says for the average household, a 2-person household on the average income of $120,000 between the two of them, they'll save $52 a week. If they had a kid in childcare, it would be $126 a week instead.
I'm pretty impressed. It's such a broad, sweeping package across so many areas that you did very well to pretty much remember that all.
Thank you, Jono. I remembered it all off the top of my head because of a photographic memory. I didn't retake any of this at all. This is the first take, one take wonder.
And that is why I give you that job to do and don't do it myself. Jono, going to bring you in here though. You managed to get hold of the sort of independent costings, and they basically commissioned someone, didn't they, to make sure that this wasn't all kind of wrong. What did that tell you? What was sort of the surprises or not so surprising things in that?
Yeah, stunning piece of journalism on my part. I asked the National Party for the Castalia costings and they gave them to me.
Brilliant. Well done.
So the leader's office, the opposition leader's office, commissioned Castalia, an economic consultancy, to run the ruler over their numbers. and they did a pretty interesting job. What I thought was notable was that they did pick up the National in a few errors that National corrected, but there were a couple of big ones where they ended up begging to differ. What's notable is that where Castalia and the National Party did differ on the costings, it was the National Party that took the more conservative line. So, for instance, National estimated the family boost tax rebate policy would cost the taxpayer $996 million over 4 years. Castalia's estimated cost was $124 million lower, and where National estimated that the revenue that would be clawed back from its so-called climate dividend was $2.36 billion, that's lower than Castalia's projection. So I do think it's a useful contrast, but I'm very well aware that the critics of National will point to the fact that this costing analysis was commissioned by the Leader's Office. They will point to the fact that Castalia has been a critic of the government in some other areas, like its Three Waters reforms, and they won't give it too much credence. And probably adding fuel to the fire, and perhaps an unwise comment from Castalia in the analysis, they criticise the government's additional investment in public services. They say, we are not aware of any evidence that additional spending has led to an increase in useful outputs. So that's going to be fuel to the fire for the critics who say that this is not an independent critique of the costings. For me, it does bring back to the fore the proposal that we had at the 2017 election to set in place an independent fiscal institution linked to Treasury that would provide independent costings of parties' policies in election campaigns. I think we need that. Just about everyone else in the OECD has got one. The OECD says they're a good idea for giving people confidence in costings going into elections. And it does mean that we don't have these constant, well, it would lessen the potential for these enormous battles over alleged fiscal holes on either side.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've nicely segued into the politics of this, and given we're called Raw Politics, let's get into the nuts and bolts of that. I mean, in terms of how it has landed, I think the general feeling seems to be that because National's bundled so many elements into this particular tax plan, as opposed to Labor, where they're going about it in a more sort of cost of living. I think they're going to have about 10 various measures. I think they still have about 3 to go on the campaign trail. And so it's a bit more piecemeal. Whereas, National, what they've done this week is very much kind of throw in a whole bunch of stuff together. It's also meant that it's announced some things that have been helpful in terms of cost of living that will go. For example, National has said that they won't continue that reduced public transport. That, of course, is one thing that Labor has been saying that people need in order to help kind of keep some money in the back pocket. So I think probably you could say Labor could have delivered a lot of what National has announced this week, and it wouldn't have looked as if it was national policy. I think it is very in the middle sort of stuff. One National Party voter did say to me over the course of this week, they thought that basically the National Party announcement could have been more targeted to sort of mobilise what is generally a sort of Labor voter base. I guess the sort of flip side of that is that you might have some national people head off to act as a result. But yeah, it was pretty wide-reaching when you have that 78,000. Obviously, above that, everyone's getting the same amount, etc. Strategically, I genuinely think National kind of like had it right this week. Yeah. Some have described it as a masterclass in terms of how they've delivered it and the sort of talking points around it. I thought Nicola Willis was brilliant in terms of how she presented it. So, yeah, it's certainly kind of put the cat amongst the pigeons, and you've certainly seen Grant Robertson and Chris Hipkins sort of scrambling a bit, responding to it. What's your kind of read been on that, Mark?
Yeah, I think you're right. The basically the two approaches being, one, put it all out in one package, or two, dribble it out a bit. And to be fair, of Labour's 10 points, a bunch of them are things they've already done well in government, like half-price public transport, like getting rid of prescription fees, or $5 prescription fees at least. So, it's not necessarily a whole 10 new policies that they're bringing to the table. But even so, because those are actually quite targeted, it's hard to be able to tell someone based on just their income and how many kids they have what their benefit is going to be. Because you have to say, well, do you take public transport to work? How many prescriptions do you get in a year? Whereas National, they can just say, give us this basic information, and they're going to be using this as they go out door knocking. They're going to have a QR code. You'll scan it on your phone. You'll put in your salary and how many kids you've got in your household and that sort of thing, and it'll pop up and say, this is how much you'll get back from us. Labour, just by the way they've structured their policy, is not going to be able to do that for people. How many kilos of potatoes do you buy in an average fortnight is much, no one knows that, but you know your paycheck and you know how many kids you have, I hope.
If I had $1 for every time you, since the GST-free policy came out, has talked about potatoes and carrots, I'd be very rich. Jono, just wanted to ask you about the start of this.
You'd be able to buy some potatoes and carrots.
I reckon I go for about 10 kilos of potatoes a month, Mark, for what it's worth.
But
I do have a lot
unhealthy.
of kids.
Jono, let's just touch quickly on earlier this week you had the government announce that they had found $4 billion behind the couch if they were going to trim back the public service and cut money, consultants, contractors, etc. It's a reasonable amount, yet National was saying that they can find another $8.5 billion to cut back in that space. Is it possible to actually do that without actually starting to impact on frontline services, do you think?
Yeah, first I want to look at the politics. I think it's a pretty savvy job by the National Party of targeting the swing voters in the centre of politics. And that is where most of the tax change benefits will sit in that sort of 30, 40 to 80 grand bracket. And that's exactly strategically where they need to be going into the election. I think they can leave the more conservative rump issues to their coalition partner in waiting, ACT, to squabble with New Zealand First and, dare I say, Freedom NZ and everyone else over issues like co-governance, and they can focus on really fighting Labour for that centre vote. And that's where, as you say, Joe, they have to avoid any criticism that they are cutting into core public services like health and education. And you'll see Grant Robertson targeting them straight away on that. You mentioned the public transport for kids and people with disabilities. We've also got the free 20 hours childcare for two-year-olds. That's a position that they don't want to get caught fighting over reduced public services.
Yeah, and I just wanted to jump in and say on the savings initiatives and on National's policy, both of them have had a sort of climate element in there. So the savings initiatives cut $236 million from of climate policies, and we found out later on Monday after the announcement that James Shaw, the climate change minister, hadn't been told about it.
Well, James Shaw found out about it when you told him about it, I think, is kind of what happened.
Yeah, more or less. It was a sort of quiet phone conversation, which I said, would you have expected to have been told about this? And he said, yeah. And I said, were you? And he said, nope. And then I asked him about some more detailed questions, and he said, I don't know. I have got no advice on this. I'm as curious as you are, basically, which I thought was going to be the main climate theme of the week. But then National has announced that they will be basically getting rid of the entire Climate Emergency Response Fund and using that money instead to pay for these tax cuts. They're calling it a carbon dividend, but economists aren't so sure it's a carbon dividend because if the carbon price rises, people don't get any more benefit out of that. And so it doesn't do the work that a dividend is supposed to do in terms of making people less grumpy, if not happy, with a rising carbon price.
Certainly a big week for someone who's interested in both politics and climate. Now, let's get ready to campaign. Great, exciting. You excited, Mark?
I'm stoked.
This weekend, we are getting out to the campaign launches. On Saturday, Labour is kicking off in Auckland, and then on Sunday we have National. Both Tim Murphy and myself will be there. Get on newsroom.co.nz to read all about it this weekend.
Make room for Newsroom in your life.
That is what we say now. It does feel like the campaign started a long time ago, though. It is kind of ridiculous to think that it doesn't actually start until this weekend. There has been a lot of policy. I think probably a lot more policy ahead of the actual campaign period than you have seen. Certainly in the sense of big announcements, really big announcements. Kind of leaves me wondering whether there's going to be anything really big or, particularly grabby for voters in the next few weeks ahead of the polling booths opening. Just want to go back a little bit to Sunday when Chris Hipkins made probably the first big rah-rah speech talking to people about what sort of a campaign he's going to lead. It was one of those speeches where he really called out things he doesn't like, the way that he doesn't want things to be, being very particular about New Zealand First, which obviously led to him announcing that they'd ruled out New Zealand First in terms of any potential government after the election, any arrangement. I guess the lull factor in that was Winston Peters ruled out Labour about 18 months ago, so I'm not sure that anyone actually thought that was ever going to happen anyway.
And nobody actually believes in these rule-ins and rule-outs anyway when it comes to the crunch after the election.
Yeah. Also, that speech was very much around Chris Hipkins talking to people around women's rights, gay rights, abortion rights. He got quite pointed at National MP Simon O'Connor when he sort of celebrated that Roe v. Wade decision in America. He sort of pointed to Christopher Luxon and, the comments that he had made when he first became leader, where he said that abortion was tantamount to murder. So it was such a different speech to what you would have seen from Jacinda Ardern, for example, and you could tell it had been written by Chris Hipkins. And also, one other thing to add to that, having spoken to people within the Labour Party since, it was the first real time that Chris Hipkins had actually got other people, other senior ministers in his cabinet to contribute to it as well and have a look at it and have the opportunity to be able to say, oh, maybe you could say this instead. And it actually got workshopped. Up until this point, Chris Hipkins has very much been doing things on his own, but he's obviously leading into the campaign with an intention to kind of use the people around him a little bit more. So, yeah, a lot going on there. You've been here amongst the madness as well, Mark. What is your feel, I guess, as we head out onto the campaign trail in terms of how things are going to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think negativity. I mean, in 2020, Jacinda Ardern promised to run a relentlessly positive campaign. Is that the phrase that she used?
It is.
And everyone here will be saying, oh, we're going to be talking about what we're doing. We're not going to be spending time talking about them. But sometimes they say really dumb things, so we need to talk about them. Turns out most of the talking is generally about the other side, at least on the Labour side of things. National, because it has these big policies that it can communicate quite clearly, is focused more on that, but even those have a cut on the government in them. Even the announcement of the tax policy by Nicola Willis talked about government spending under Labour, where they've gone wrong, how they've ruined the economy, etc., etc., etc. And so, it's definitely shaping up to be a much more of a back and forth campaign than just putting your ideas out there and advocating for them. That's what it's felt like so far. I mean, particularly since the tax policy announcement, just the array of press releases and stand-ups and back and forths, and like you said, Joe, it's hard to keep track of for us here. I don't know how people in the electorate are receiving it one way or another.
Yeah, and I think another point on that is how it all gets lost too, because there's so much noise, and we've talked about this before with the GST free on fresh and frozen fruit and vegetables. There was so much policy at the same time, and there was so much noise. I don't know how many voters yet have really digested what that policy is all about. So, that's going to be a big job for Labour and also for National with its policies this week to make sure that people actually know what it is that they're offering. Jono, in terms of legislation, there's been a hell of a lot of that too, pretty manic on that front.
Yeah, there's been a real flurry of last-minute lawmaking, hasn't there? And look, some of it I think the government needed to do. I look at the pushing through the last of the three waters reform bills. That forces National, when it comes in, to actually repeal the law, as it said it's going to, and put in place an alternative, because we can't leave the water infrastructure as it is. So that gives National quite a tough task if National is elected. On the other hand, we saw local government minister Kieran McAnulty introduced a bill to lower the voting age in council elections. Now, this to me felt like somewhat of a pet project. I'm not really sure it was the message that Labour wanted to be sending in the final week of Parliament, that this is the most important thing on their legislative agenda.
It is interesting looking at the stuff that they've introduced. It's stuff that they were working on and hope to have more time to get to. Willie Jackson's put in the digital news bargaining bill to make Meta and Google pay media outlets for using their content. But it's not expected, I don't think, to get through before the end of Parliament. I think for many Labour ministers, they'll be wondering, is this the last chance that they have to pass legislation for 3 or 6 or 9 years? Depending on how the election goes, it might be, which makes sort of the array of what they're doing a little bit stranger to me, Jono, because I agree, yes, lowering the voting age, yes, sorting out the media and digital landscape type stuff is important, but is that really the big unanswered or unfinished projects that Labour has? It doesn't feel like that they're trying to rush those through anyways, and maybe that speaks to some confidence on their part that they'll be able to be making these decisions on October 15.
Yeah, I mean, Chris Hipkins was stood at the podium doing post-cab on Monday, and I did...
Feels like a long time ago.
It does. And I did ask him at the end of it, I said, this could be the last time that you stand here as Prime Minister and, talk to journalists and answer what he probably thinks are inane questions for 45 minutes. And I said, are you having these moments where you're like, this could be the last of this could be the last of that? And of course, him in his usual sort of smiley chip away said, no, there's no plan B. Plan A is to win and to be back here. But you do wonder whether some of the ministers in and around the place are having those sorts of moments where they're thinking, is this it? Am I saying goodbye to my beehive office with a lovely waterfront view for the very last time? And from Chris Hipkins' perspective, if you go back to 2017, you had the situation where John Key had resigned about a year out from when the election ended up being, and Bill English had that time as the Prime Minister and then sort of ran like an aggressive campaign and, a really good campaign up against Jacinda Ardern in 2017. And we all know how that cookie crumbled with the coalition negotiations with Winston Peters, and National was in opposition and Bill English was gone not that much later. And now you've got the situation with Chris Hipkins, who's been in the role for, 8 months, is heading into what is going to be a pretty tightly contested election, not knowing what's going to happen on the other side of it, and that could be it. I'm sure he's very hopeful that there's another full term to come on the other side of it. But from a legislative perspective, there's a lot of stuff that I'm sure he wanted to do, and in the education space in particular, he said there's a lot of stuff that he couldn't do because of COVID, because they couldn't put the pressure on schools to be doing stuff at a time when they were already so loaded up as a result of what was happening with lockdowns. And, if this is it, then there's that chance is kind of gone really for him, because how many years might some of these MPs be in opposition for? And some of them will think long and hard about whether they want to do that. Not saying the election is done. It's absolutely up for play. But yeah, I'm sure there are some thoughts in some MPs' minds at the moment about how things will look after October 14, that's for sure. It's
just so tight that no one would put, you can't say for certain that you'll be coming back. It's not like 2020 where the polls were pretty clear. You'd had the COVID bump. It was obvious what the outcome would be. Here, no one would say for certain. Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you've watched, read or listened to this week that you have enjoyed. I'm going to go first this week. I am recommending Audrey Young from The Herald. She has done a really good piece called The Best and Worst Behaved MPs in the House this year. There is very little, if anything, I disagree with her on in it. Great piece, lots of colour. Highly recommend. Jono, what about you?
I'm going to be a little bit dry. I was just reading an article this morning from Reuters on Deutsche Welle, the German TV network site. They're reporting on a €32 billion tax cuts package just introduced by the German government, which seems pretty pointed for the argument we're having over here in New Zealand about tax cuts. Now, 32 billion euros, that's 58 billion New Zealand dollars, so it probably puts the National Party's tax cuts package in perspective. But like New Zealand, Germany's economy is flatlining at present. It is growth is round about the zero mark, which is where ours has been as well. Unlike New Zealand, Germany has a lot of debt, and they're going to be paying for this tax cuts package from their borrowing. So that's a very different scenario, and this is being brought in by a troubled German coalition government that's fighting for survival in next year's election. I think the interesting thing is that Germany's tax cuts are intended to stimulate their economy, to give it a bit of a kick up the backside and get it running again. National's policy package here is unashamedly about winning votes.
And Mark.
I'm going to recommend a piece on Newsroom this week by Emma Hatton titled Sir Roger Douglas's Nephew Bets Business on Big ACT Win. It's about an ACT candidate number 16 on the list who has put his business up to sale. He's so certain he's going to get into Parliament. The polls are, have him right on the borderline there, so it's no guarantee. But he did tell Emma in the end that he would put a condition in on any sale agreement that says, if I don't get into Parliament, I can back out, which is the prudent thing to do, if the less entertaining one.
I think that's got to be the first time that caveat has ever been entered into any business sale and purchase agreement.
It's very fence city too. Oh, I'm putting it all on, I'm going to win. Oh, but actually, maybe I won't. And that's it from Raw Politics for this week. Thank you to our producer Hugo Stewart and our readers, listeners and viewers. Please send any burning questions you have to me, jo.moyer@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us next week, same time, same place, here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.